Prospering principle of love. Love's answer to the call of freedom. This is the last in the series I'm doing on love. It's the last Sunday of February, where we normally acknowledge love in its many forms, its many levels of expression. So I thought it would be important or interesting to kind of cover this idea of how love and prosperity work together. And I think that one of the best illustrations I can come up with is what you see here in this photo of the chick that is just broken out of the shell. And of course we know that this is a staged photo, because when chicks break out of shells they look a little different than that. They're not real loving, soft, fluffy, and cuddly until a little while. But it's a real miracle. I think I've shared with you the story. I received a little 2-egg incubator when I was a kid. And my grandfather and I went out to farm and found some fertilized eggs. Not just every egg that you pick up is fertilized. You probably know that. If you're not from the rural area, you may not know that. You can't just take an egg out of your refrigerator and hatch it. So we went out and found a farmer that had some eggs that were fertilized, but the interesting thing about these eggs were they'd been in the refrigerator all night long. So it was pretty iffy as to whether they would hatch or not. So I put them in the incubator, marked a little X, and turned them over every day, and was very faithful in that, and pretty soon began to hear a peeping sound, so I knew at least one of them was alive. And sure enough, 21 days passed, and it was a school day. I knew the chicken was going to hatch that day, so I told my mother I was not feeling so well, and I think she understood the situation. She showed up for my birth, so I figured I should show up for this chicken's birth. But anyway, I watched it hatch out, and they look like, I don't know what they look like exactly, kind of a cross between a lizard and something else. They're all wet and pretty strange looking little animals. But pretty soon they're up on their feet, and they're walking around looking for food, pecking away at things, and it's really an amazing thing. But I thought that this process is one of the best ways. I named the chicken Rufus, by the way. It was a hen. It was a black chicken. I don't know what kind it was, but it was. It would often follow me to school, and it just bonded. We bonded immediately, so it was one of my best friends. But until our beagle ate it, but I managed to move on, and I think I got another chicken after that. But anyway, that whole process is incredible. It's something we take for granted. It's taking place right now in nature. Birds are starting to do their mating calls and all of that, and then pretty soon we're going to have nests full of eggs, and pretty soon there'll be little chicks running all through the yard. We're worried about our cats getting and all of that kind of thing. But it's a pretty miraculous transformation that goes on, and I think I'm glad I was able to witness that process. But I'm using the idea here with love, is love draws to us that which is for our highest good and dissolves that which is not. If you think of the chicken, the process it goes through, and every living thing actually goes through this. You and I went through it. We were not in an egg per se. We matured in our mother's womb, but it's the same idea, the same process. Everything goes through this. There's a maturing process, a growth process that has to be protected and cared for and all. But inside the egg, just you think of love drawing to that chicken embryo, everything that it needs for its highest good. It's all self-contained in that egg. It's kind of a Garden of Eden, if you think of it this way. And I have did a series on this one time, that if we think of the Garden of Eden, more as an egg than as something that, this horrible thing that the Adam and Eve were cast out of. We get another view of the whole thing. It's kind of interesting, too. The Gnostic Christians saw it that way. The serpent was actually considered a good guy in the Gnostic teachings, not a bad, evil, manifestation of the devil. And the reason they saw the serpent that way is because the serpent was that thing that allowed them, Adam and Eve, to go to a larger experience once they filled the inside of that egg. Nature calls that an egg tooth. I don't know if you're familiar with that or not, but a chick, when it hatches out, has a little bump on the end of its beak that is an egg tooth. It's designed to help break out of that shell, and in a sense, that's the serpent. It's the way out of that environment, because that environment is perfect up to a point. Then what happens? The chick fills that entire environment where there's no more room for growth. If it was a plant, we would say it becomes root bound. It fills the whole thing, draws all the nutrients. And the chick instinctively knows to start pecking away at that, what used to be a Garden of Eden can now become a hell if they don't get out. So it's a whole different way to think of that. And I think that's a good way to think of it. And as I'm speaking here today, just think of your own life in the same way. We grow into things and we fill them up. They can no longer contain us and we have to move on. And when that happens, we feel very cramped. Our life feels like it's not working, like things are falling apart. And we consider that a negative, and so we work with that. But if you think of this idea of love draws to us that which is for our highest good, that's as long as the shell is working, as long as that environment is working for us, that's a good thing. It's drawn that to us. It is today's answer, but it is tomorrow's problem. And that's where we have to be tuned in to ourselves on a spiritual path. That we are trying to create the perfect shell, one that we never grow out of. And that doesn't happen. So love draws to us that which is for our highest good and dissolves that which is not. That's the cracking of the shell. There's a time when the shell is for our highest good, and then a time when it's not. It can be the very same shell. So it's a thing that we want to keep forefront in our minds as we're going through life, and as we start feeling cramped in some situation. Is our highest good that which enables us to continue living unchallenged in our comfort zone, or is it that which is nudging us out? So what is the chick's highest good while it's in the shell? The answer you come up with is a whole different thing from the answer you'll get is what is the chick's highest good when it breaks out of the shell. There's a whole different set of answers. So we are always doing this. We're always growing in terms of our awareness. We are spiritual beings. There's no limit to who and what we are. Even when you affirm that your soul is complete, it's like your head doesn't get around that totally. And it never will. Because we cannot encompass in our thinking infinity. And that's what we are as spiritual beings. When people experience divine love, when they have these transforming awarenesses of the presence of God as love, they can't put it into words. We have no language to describe God as love. We say God is love and we instantly translate that into a human level of experience. God is loving like my parents are loving, or I'm loving toward my children, or whatever. We put it into a human level, and the moment we do that, of course, we make it conditional. And in the traditional religion, mainstream kind of thinking, the conditions are as long as I'm following the rules, God loves me. Well, God may punish me, but it's because God loves me, trying to get me on the straight and narrow so that I will end up in heaven. God loves me so much that he's given me all these many ways to make it to heaven. So God is love up to a point. What if I don't make it? Then am I cast into hell? Am I punished because I was not good enough? Because I didn't make the right choices? Because I made so many mistakes? Because I'm just human? And I failed the test? So is God's love up to the point of where I fail? Totally fail? That would be conditional. And that's why I think it's important for us to kind of revisit this whole idea of heaven and hell as a place we go when we leave this body. Do we have to earn the love of God? If God is love and God loves, then there's nothing we can do to change that. No matter how far out in the far countries, I've said many times that we go, the Father never changed his attitude toward the Son. But we put all these conditions on love. And when we suffer, we may be saying, I wonder if God's testing me, or wonder if God is challenging me with something that, some lesson I need to learn so that I can get back on the straight and narrow. There is really no religious path that has been put out before us that is either necessary or adequate to maintain the love of God. None of these things are required. And I think that's what the prodigal son's all about. It's one of the best depictions of what religion ought to be. Is okay, I'm a miserable sinner. I have done the very worst possible thing that you can imagine. I have had the most negative thoughts. I've had the lowest self-esteem. I've done every bad thing you can imagine. That's the prodigal son. He went out and did everything, the very worst things that he could possibly do. He spent all of his father's inheritance on wild living, wild women, and all the stuff that it points out. He ends up so desperate that he is feeding the swine of a farmer, and he is eating the food that he's feeding them. So you have to put that in perspective. That's as low as a Jewish boy can get. That's what Jesus is saying. This guy is as low as he can possibly get, and he makes a decision to go home. So the heaven and hell, all of the stuff that we go through is in us. It's not God. It has nothing to do with God. It has everything to do with us, what we're going through, how we perceive ourselves. I'm not worthy of God's love. I feel that. There's days I feel that and pretend like that's true. And I'm just saying that in a general sense. We can all get to that place where I have sinned and I don't deserve the love of God. But God cannot think that way. It's impossible. We do it to ourselves, and that's where the heaven and hell is. Heaven is that state of knowing we are one always with the infinite. And it's not an intellectual thing, it is an experience. And we can experience that. We can experience that knowing, that connection with the infinite. And it's not just a passing thought. It's not just something that we eventually conclude after we've been through the whole religious gauntlet and we decide we're going to settle on something that feels good to us. The spiritual awakening is an organic thing. We are spiritual beings. We're fully developed at this moment. And we can have these breakthroughs where we absolutely know that. And we can know it to the point where the problems I'm going through, I know that I have created. It's my perception. God can't stop loving me. God can't stop being love expressed through me. But I can pretend as if that's true. I can act as if that's true. And when I do, I am in the valley of the shadow of death. But as the psalmist says, we pass through that, we walk through that, just keep walking. We're on this human adventure that we don't always stay tuned to our source. We get very diverted in taking care of this body and all of the things that it goes through. The embryo of the chick develops naturally and comfortably within its shell. But the day comes when the shell, once a solution, becomes a problem. And just think of the shell in terms of your own life. How many times have you prayed for something, got the answer, and then not too far down the road, it becomes another problem? Nothing stays the same. We don't look for finality. We don't look for that perfect shell on this planet. We'll never find it, except in our own thinking. That if your life is feeling cramped right now, you say, well, God, I asked for this, and you came through and gave me the right answers, and you don't seem to be answering me now. Maybe I'm not doing something right. It's the conditional thing again. We see ourselves in a shell of thought. The reason I'm feeling restricted is because I have put myself in a shell of thought. So it's not something God has done. It's not a test. I've simply grown to the edge of the shell. And that's it's a natural thing. It's not something that we should wonder, why is this happening to me? If we will just acknowledge that this is what is happening. It's very natural. You look all through nature and you see it happening all around you. The caterpillar, the chrysalis, the butterfly, same thing. It's exactly the same kind of idea. The caterpillar goes into this, weaves itself into this chrysalis, and it comes out something different. It's like a time of meditation, a time of recentering, a time of knowing that my life as a caterpillar is no longer satisfying. There's something that needs to be brought forth. And so I go through a process. What is that process? I become still and I listen. And I let the natural promptings of spirit push through me and reveal to me that which needs to happen next. There's no right and wrong way to approach life, but there is an understanding. And I'm talking about specific conditions. Is it right to have a good relationship with somebody, or is it right to be single? There's no right and wrong. It depends on where you are at this moment. It's not really right to be in a relationship that is cramping you, that is a shell, one that you outgrew a long time ago. Don't you know how you crack through that shell and then you go back to that relationship, you crawl back through that hole, get back in the shell. And you say, I wish this would work, but it's just not going to work. It's crawling back into the chrysalis. It was comfortable while it lasted, but what if it is no longer lasting? We don't blame God for that. Our soul is infinite. And whenever we draw a circle around ourselves, a limitation of some kind, with our thinking, with our fear, and that's why we don't let go. We're afraid to let go. The egg inside that egg is comfortable, or it was. But we get sometimes to the point where we'll take the discomfort inside the shell to the unknowing outside the shell. We don't know what's going to happen, so we crawl back in the shell. That's the temptation. And there's no map that tells you how to get out of that. But there is an inner knowing for every one of us that says, okay, you don't know the answer, but stop and listen. Make a commitment to listen, to be still and know, to let Spirit speak to you. You already know what you're doing wrong. You already know the pain of trying to stay in that small experience, of keeping that safe. You know what that feels like. Does that feel good? I've pointed out this, just ask yourself the question, if all limitations were removed from me at this moment, what would I do? That's what Spirit is saying to you. Your answer to that question is what Spirit is saying to you. You say, well, I don't know how to do what I would like to do. And that's okay. But are you willing to do it? Are you willing to let go of the shell, to see that shell as part of your past? To say, this is no longer part of my identity. And I'm free to walk away from that. You're not letting go of anything that will help you or protect you in any way whatsoever. And we all have our own kinds of shells. There's everybody we kind of go through life creating new shells, leaving them, and then moving to a new one. We just keep doing this. That's how life progresses. That's how we progress through this experience. But the soul is the steady anchor through the whole thing, and that's where we have to tie ourselves to. Soul or God. It's really synonymous. You are an expression of God. I am an expression of God. That anchor is always there. But if your life is feeling cramped, it's because you're not living out of that in some way. You're clinging probably to some shell, some aspect of a shell. When we find ourselves in this predicament, we usually pray for some alteration in the shell. We need more room. I need a bigger egg, bigger shell. And breaking out of that doesn't really seem to be an option, again, because we don't know how to do it. But I talk about God as life, love, power, and intelligence. So by saying that, we're affirming that the intelligence of God is always with me. The intelligence of God knows how to break through shells. The intelligence of God invented the shell, invented the egg tooth, invented the life outside the shell. Did Adam and Eve leave the Garden of Eden and go to a place where there's no God? If God is omnipresent, God would be just as present on the outside of the garden as on the inside. But it would be very easy for Adam and Eve to believe that that was not true. We are in the womb for 9 months. You think about that. All of your needs are met. You don't know what the word poverty means. You don't know what the word cold means. You don't know what the word hungry means. Probably don't know what the word fear means. Of course, you can get into the psychological thing that the baby picks up everything around. But you as an individual are totally embraced, totally taken care of. And then the day comes when you're born. You leave that shell. Suddenly you're cold. Somebody's spanking you. Lights are too bright. You see these weird people with masks on. You have entered an alien world you know nothing about. So you do the only thing that you know how to do when you're unsure of yourself, and that's start crying. So then we start thinking in terms of our supplies outside of us. As the fetus, we were supplied from within. But we separate from that womb, from that environment, and suddenly our supply is outside. It starts there, and there's somebody there to hold us, to care for us. Our comfort comes from outside. Everything from that point on comes from outside. That's why we lose sight of the soul, I believe, and start focusing on the body. And so it all becomes about creating shells for the body that are comfortable. And when those shells break, we don't understand when we get to the edge of them. We don't understand why we feel so cramped. Because those aren't the shells that are the permanent shell that are intended to be there for us at all times, to be our comfort, to be our supply. We are designed to carry with us that which created us in the first place, God. We are spiritual beings that have taken on a body that was developed in a womb and is now outside of the womb in this world where we need to support the body. And so our whole value system shifts to the outside things, and we spend our lives trying to set up everything outside of ourselves to make that perfect egg, to make that perfect environment. So we turn away from our source. That's the dilemma we're all in. We're trying to support the body all the time, and you have to support it. There's nothing wrong with doing that. But in doing that, we lose sight of the soul. We lose sight of our spiritual connection, of our guidance, of the intelligence that brought us forth, brought us to this point. The chick, uncertain of what lay on the other side, but sure that life has become a bit too cramped, instinctively begins pecking at the shell. I have said many times that we all desire greater freedom because our soul is already free. And that's what the spiritual path is all about. It's reconnecting. See, when we were physically born, we didn't lose something. Physically, yes, we did. We lost an environment where we were totally cared for, totally taken care of. We had to start fending for ourselves. We had to start taking care of this body ourselves. And the human being is one of the longest nurtured offspring there is on this planet. Some of our kids are still dependent on us at 50 and 60 years old. Kind of unusual in the animal world. But that happens, and what we're talking about here is the connection we lose is that spiritual connection. What made us alive in the womb in the first place? That has never changed. Our soul was never born. Our parents did not give birth to our soul. They gave birth to our body. The soul is our vehicle, but it's not us. It's our vehicle. So the chick, uncertain of what lay on the other side, but sure that life has become a bit too cramped, instinctively begins pecking at the shell. And that's what we need to do. We keep our awareness focused on, I am a spiritual being, and my cramped life is not necessarily a bad thing. I'm concluding something. I'm coming to the end of a phase. And the wisdom in me knows how to open the door if the door needs to be opened, knows how to start pecking at that shell. It's given me all the equipment that I need to do that. Love urges the chick into a freer environment while dissolving the old, now confining world within the shell. Within moments of hatching, a life-sustaining environment becomes a useless pile of debris. That's how you can think of your past. Some people never let go of that shell. That maybe was a very meaningful time to them, so they never truly let it go. Always looking back to that golden past. But we are alive now, and if we are feeling cramped in our life, all we need to do is begin looking at it from a different perspective. I'm an eternal being going through this earthly life, and I'm going to go through many shells, and maybe I'm in one now. Maybe I'm coming to the outside edge of one now. So is that a bad thing? Or is it a good thing? Can I look within myself, call upon God to guide me on how to deal with this feeling of limitation, this restriction? Affirming the prospering principle of love is at work in us now is a willingness to acknowledge our desire for greater freedom. Is God calling us to move into a broader experience? And that's really it. You know, we want to keep that in mind all the time. We're being guided. We're being led all the time. It doesn't matter if you step off a cliff, step into a mud hole, step into something that is difficult for you. You are a spiritual being. That will always be true. And maybe you'll learn something from that experience, maybe not. But the experience is not your life. That's the shell that you're in at this moment, and it will crack. The time will come when you come to the end of it. And be willing to crack it and then let it go, move on. Does that make any sense? I hope so. Well, thank you for coming out, and we'll pick this up again next week.